All right, I think we'll get started tonight. I'm Dr. Michael O'Connor. This is a lecture that I am entitling To Poes, question mark? You heard that inflection. To Poes. All right. So thank you, welcome, and thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Just to warm up, setting the scene. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. And this from the marginalia, we can at any time double the beauty of an actual landscape by half closing our eyes to look at it. So I think I'm going to back this up to some pictures and have you sort of pay attention to me instead of what's on the screen. On October 3rd, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found on the streets of Baltimore, Maryland, incoherent and delirious. He had been traveling from Richmond to New York. His appearance, according to Dr. Joseph Snodgrass in his diary, was repulsive, with unkempt hair, a haggard, unwashed face, and lusterless and vacant eyes. His clothing was apparently not his own. He was taken in a semi-catatonic state to Washington College Hospital, where he was denied any visitors and was confined in a prison-like room with barred windows in a section of the building reserved for drunks. He died just a few days later on Sunday, October 7th at 5 a.m. in the morning without ever being able to explain how he came to be in the state he was in. The world was only left with questions and an enduring mystery. We'll come back to that. Today, more often than not, it's recognized that Edgar Allan Poe gave the world a rich literary heritage. Tales of terror, detective and mystery stories, classic haunting, and romantic poems. Today, this dark romantic writer is still remembered fondly for his verses, his literary criticism, and his stories of the grotesque and arabesque. But we must ask this evening, who was Edgar Allan Poe? Reading a range of literary history, criticism, and some biographies seems to reveal that there were perhaps two Edgar Allan Poes, not one. Critically, one Edgar Allan Poe was loved by European critics almost unanimously. Frenchmen such as Malamar and Baudelaire thought him the greatest of all American writers. Rossetti, Swinburne, Stevenson, Shaw, and Arthur Conan Doyle all considered him exceptional. Tennyson heaped great praise upon him. Some critics would go on to state that Poe greatly influenced generations of writers after him, both European and American, including figures such as Ambrose Bierce and William Faulkner. However, there seemed to be another Edgar Allan Poe who was not so admired during his lifetime and even beyond. Transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that Poe was little more than a, quote, jingle man. Fireside poet James Russell Lowell satirized Poe's writing as, quote, sheer fudge. Realist writer Henry James later would call an admiration for Poe's writing a, quote, mark of a decidedly primitive stage of reflection, unquote. But on the other side of the coin, one Poe seemed to be the Southern gentleman, an intellectual genius, a man who greatly loved his wife and mother-in-law, who acquired a refined sense of European taste and carried a noble lineage. This Poe was a West Point cadet, an excellent serviceman. He was a shrewd literary critic, a wondrous poet, an entertaining, pithy, and psychological short story writer. Yet the other Poe was apparently a constant drunkard, supposedly an opium addict, a gambler, an amoral hoaxer who was psychologically disturbed and not a true literary critic at all, but rather a hatchet man whose sole purpose in life seemed to be to attack the American literary giants of his day and age in the newspapers. This Poe was contemptuous of fellow writers, a man who resented Boston and New York's seemingly cultural supremacy over the rest of America, especially the writers of the South. This Poe was designated a crude man who unfairly called Longfellow, America's great and supreme poet, a plagiarist, and who labeled the literary city of Boston as Frogpondium. So, what are we to make of these contradictory views? Perhaps by examining the tropes and characteristics of a number of Poe's key works, we can decide for ourselves, and as such, forever lay to rest one of these two Poes, the genius or the crackpot, discovering which man is genuine and which the imagined doppelganger. Now some context for you, and I am going to move forward here. Little context of Poe's work before we begin examining some of his own words. Within the larger literary context of his day, this was the age of literary romanticism. It's the age of Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats. On these shores, it was the age of Bryant, Longfellow, Emerson, Holmes, Whittier, Lowell, Irving, Cooper. All great romantics. What were these romantics about? What did they believe, whether on that side of the Atlantic or this? They believed in these things, that the individual was the center of all life, all experience, all art. That there needed to be a stress on individual feelings over traditional forms and conventional knowledge. These writers put a high value on the creative imagination, what came forth from within. Intuition, so important, welling up from inside, should be used to find higher forms of truth rather than reliance upon mere facts, mere logic, scientific deduction. Those were things from an earlier age. And then finally, nature, according to the Romanticist, is the key medium for seeking the truth. Now, interestingly, within this context of literary romanticism, we find a broad spectrum, a dichotomy. We find the light romantics. You're familiar with Emerson, with Thoreau. Those who, and many of the English writers, those who believe that these impulses, these intuitive impulses, these transcendental truths descended upon one in a moment of genius, and truth and beauty became known to the individual. And yet, beyond what we call the positive romantics, who received these sudden insights on truth and beauty, there was also a dark side to the romantics. There was a capacity for the negative, horrible, aberrant, tragic acts of self-assertion and evil bubbling up once again from inside. If you're pulling truths, if you're pulling impulses, if you're pulling knowledge from inside, yes, it could be good and positive, but it could also be dark, evil. Here, the universe and the individual self may be things of which one must be quite afraid. Poe, of course, and many of the American dark romantics or negative romantics fell into this category more often than not. They too, over on this side of the Atlantic, had some common characteristics. They believed, just to reiterate much of what I've said, that humanity contained the possibility within each individual to go wrong. That there was a tendency, or at least an opportunity, for evil. Poe in his writings talked about riding on the left shoulder of each of us was what he called the imp of the perverse. Something, some evil, some secret self, some whisperer that whispered in one's ear, leading one to evil and madness. Sometimes I suppose the imp of the perverse could end up being a face on the back of a head, to use a contemporary context. They also thought that humans could become too involved in the self. Remember, this is all about the individual self. But what if this self-absorption leads to crime, evil, insanity? What if the individual wanders too far beyond the bounds and constraints of society and is never able to return? Obviously, the negative romantics' writings tended towards the psychological. They dealt with the workings of the mind long before Freud was writing about such things. They viewed the mind as a sort of Pandora's box. Who knows what you might release when exploring too deeply inside the inner chambers of the mind? And they too thought and often wrote of the inner states of the mind and the psyche as related in fiction to a physical environment, such as a natural setting, or as I'll talk about soon, such as the architecture of a room or a house or a building. Now, you're probably all familiar, once again, we're taking the context of the Romantics and now applying it to a set of literary characteristics. You're probably very familiar with the Gothic, and I'm not going to linger on elements of the Gothic because we're celebrating these elements even now at this time. But things like terror, gloom, mystery, the idea of exotic settings isolated in time and space, hidden doors, secret subterranean passages, concealed stairwells, often events that were violent or macabre, and a disturbed or unnatural relation between the orders of things that are often separate, such as life, death, good, evil, life, dream, reality, rationality, and madness. I know many of you see where this is going. The whole idea of a hidden double reality beneath the surface of what first appears to be a single narrative becomes important. This brings us to Edgar Allan Poe, and examining the works of Poe, not singly, not in isolation, but as a whole, in mass, starts to reveal a set of intertextual characteristics. And the motifs that I will talk about tonight, there are more, but the ones that I'll discuss tonight are what I'll title the unreliable narrator, or sometimes the removed narrator. The motif of doubling, or doubleness, or doppelgangers, or twins. How architecture inspires concepts of enclosure and circumscription, and being trapped, compressed in small, tiny spaces, dark, coffin-like. And finally, how Poe, in much of his writing, speaks of allegories of the struggle for the mind and the soul, the battle between good and evil, the battle between perhaps one Poe and another.